Hey everyone, and welcome back. You know how sometimes you just get the urge to hop in a time machine and zoom back to another era?
Oh, yeah, totally.
Well, today we're kind of doing that in a way as we delve into the life and times of one of the most fascinating and, let's be honest, controversial figures in American history.
I'm intrigued already.
I'm Hari, and this is Kamini, our resident history guru, and together we're going to take a deep dive into the world of Andrew Jackson, the seventh president of the United States.
Old Hickory himself, a man who rose from humble beginnings to become a war hero, a political powerhouse, and a lightning rod for controversy.
Right from the start, it's clear that Jackson's life was anything but ordinary. I mean, talk about a tough childhood, orphaned at 14 after witnessing the revolution firsthand. It's no wonder he developed a deep distrust of the elite and a fierce determination to carve his own path.
Yeah, you can definitely see how those early experiences shaped his worldview and fueled his ambition. He went from a frontier lawyer to a military leader, taking on challenges and making a name for himself.
And then there's that whole uh, fascinating and somewhat scandalous story about his marriage to Rachel Donaldson Robards.
Oh, yes. That's a tale for the ages.
Hmm.
Apparently, when they met Rachel was still technically married to another man, which caused quite a stir back then and became a point of contention throughout his political career.
It's amazing how personal lives could become political fodder even back then. But it seems like Jackson never shied away from a challenge, whether it's on the battlefield or in the political arena.
Speaking of battlefields, Jackson's military career is full of dramatic twists and turns. His victory against the Creek Nation at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814 solidified his reputation as a brilliant and sometimes ruthless military strategist.
It's interesting how perceptions of military tactics change over time. What was considered necessary for victory back then might be viewed quite differently today.
Right.
But there's no denying that Jackson was a skilled and decisive leader.
And then, of course, there's the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, the battle that made him a national hero. The War of 1812 wasn't exactly going America's way, but Jackson, with his ragtag army of militia volunteers and even some pirates, pulled off an incredible victory against the mighty British.
It's like something out of a movie, and it really cemented his place in American history. It seems like those experiences battling adversity and leading against the odds really shaped his approach to leadership and his views on power dynamics.
Absolutely. You can see those influences in his later political career as he championed the common man and challenged the established order. He became a voice for those who felt disenfranchised, a symbol of hope for those seeking change.
And that brings us to his entry into the world of politics, which, as I understand it, was just as dramatic and unpredictable as his military exploits.
Oh, definitely. His path to the presidency was anything but smooth, starting with that incredibly contentious election of 1824.
That's the one where he won the popular vote but lost in the House of Representatives, right?
Right. Exactly. It was a four-way race between some of the most prominent figures of the time, and Jackson emerged as the clear favorite among the people. But the Electoral College is a different story. No candidate secured a majority, so the decision went to the House.
And that's where John Quincy Adams came out on top.
Yeah, amidst accusations of backroom deals and what some called a corrupt bargain between Adams and another contender, Henry Clay, you can imagine how furious Jackson and his supporters were.
That must have been a bitter pill to swallow, especially for someone who prided himself on representing the common man.
It was a turning point for Jackson in American politics. This perceived injustice fueled his determination and led to the formation of the Democratic Party, a force that would reshape the nation's political landscape.
And in 1828, Jackson had his rematch, securing a landslide victory over Adams.
It was a triumphant moment for Jackson and his supporters, but the campaign was brutal, filled with personal attacks and mudslinging, a stark reminder that even back then, politics could be a vicious game.
Sadly, just weeks before his inauguration, tragedy struck when his beloved wife Rachel died.
Jackson was devastated and blamed the stress of the campaign and the vicious attacks on Rachel's character for her passing. It was a heartbreaking reminder that even amidst political triumphs, personal loss can cast a long shadow.
It makes you wonder how that profound experience shaped his approach to the presidency.
It's definitely something to consider as we delve into his time in office, a period marked by both bold actions and deep controversies.
Stay tuned as we uncover the complexities of Andrew Jackson's presidency in our next segment. Jackson's presidency was definitely marked by some bold decisions, some that still resonate today.
Oh, absolutely. One that immediately comes to mind is the Indian Removal Act of 1830, a policy that had devastating consequences for Native American tribes.
Yeah, the Indian Removal Act, it authorized the president to negotiate treaties with tribes east of the Mississippi with the goal of relocating them west, But I think it's safe to say that voluntary wasn't always the reality on the ground.
You're right. The act, while framed as a way to protect Native Americans from encroachment by white settlers, ultimately led to the forced displacement of thousands from their ancestral homelands.
It's a really dark chapter in American history, and one that raises serious questions about the limits of Jacksonian democracy.
Definitely. And it's especially troubling when you consider that many of these tribes, particularly in the Southeast, had made significant efforts to assimilate into white American culture.
They were developing their own systems of government, adopting agricultural practices, even converting to Christianity.
Exactly. They were adapting and evolving, but they were still perceived as a threat, an obstacle to westward expansion.
And the consequences were horrific. The forced relocation of tribes, including the infamous Trail of Tears, during which thousands of Cherokee died from exposure, disease, and starvation.
It's a stark reminder of the human cost of these policies, and it forces us to confront the contradictions inherent in the idea of progress.
And speaking of confronting contradictions, Jackson's commitment to preserving the Union was really put to the test during the nullification crisis.
Oh, the nullification crisis. That was a showdown over tariffs, taxes on imported goods. South Carolina, heavily reliant on foreign trade, viewed these tariffs as an economic attack.
And they took a pretty radical stance invoking the concept of nullification, the idea that states could declare federal laws void within their borders.
It was a direct challenge to federal authority, and Jackson, despite being a supporter of states' rights in many cases, saw this as a threat to national unity.
He famously declared, "Our federal union, it must be preserved."
And he backed up his words with action-threatening military force if South Carolina didn't comply.
So he was willing to use force to maintain the Union, but he also recognized the need for compromise, right?
Exactly. He worked behind the scenes to find a solution that would appease South Carolina without undermining federal authority.
It's a reminder that leadership often requires a balancing act between different interests and perspectives.
Absolutely. And speaking of balancing acts, Jackson's presidency also saw another major showdown this time over the Second Bank of the United States.
The bank war. That was a battle for the ages.
It really was. Jackson viewed the bank as a corrupt institution controlled by a wealthy elite, a threat to the economic freedom of ordinary Americans.
And he wasn't afraid to take on the financial establishment, vetoing the bank's recharter in a move that sent shockwaves through the nation.
It was a bold move, one that sparked intense debate about the role of government in the economy, a debate that continues in many ways to this day.
So we see Jackson tackling these complex issues, shaping the nation's economic landscape and facing down challenges to federal authority, all while dealing with personal tragedies and navigating a rapidly changing world.
And let's not forget about the man himself, the personality behind the policies. He was known for his fiery temperament, his willingness to stand up for what he believed in, even if it meant dueling with his opponents.
That's right, he was a survivor too, enduring Duel's assassination attempts and even carrying a bullet near his heart for decades.
He definitely earned that nickname, Old Hickory, tough as seasoned wood.
But beneath that gruff exterior, there was also a man of deep loyalty and conviction, someone who fiercely protected his friends and family.
It's that combination of strength, determination, and connection to the common man that made him such a powerful and enduring figure in American history.
So how do we reconcile these different aspects of his personality?
I think it's essential to remember that Jackson was a man of his time, shaped by the prevailing beliefs and values of his era.
That's a great point. It's a reminder that judging historical figures solely through a modern lens can be misleading.
It's all about understanding the context, the complexities, the light and shadow that make up a life, especially a life as impactful as Andrew Jackson's.
You know, it's amazing to think that even after 2 terms as president filled with all those battles and controversies, Jackson didn't just ride off into the sunset.
He didn't. He retreated to his beloved hermitage in Tennessee, but he didn't exactly fade into the background. He became this sort of elder statesman, offering advice, shaping political debates, and advocating for the causes he believed in.
And one of those causes, as I recall, was the annexation of Texas, which would have huge consequences for the nation and its ongoing struggle with slavery.
Oh, absolutely.
What?
Jackson was a firm believer in westward expansion, and he saw Texas, which had declared independence from Mexico in 1836, as rightfully belonging to the United States, manifest destiny and all that. But the issue of annexation was tangled up with the incredibly volatile current of slavery, which was already creating this dangerous rift between North and South.
It's almost ironic, isn't it? The man who threatened to use force to preserve the Union during the nullification crisis, now involved in a debate that could potentially tear it apart.
It's definitely a complex situation, and Jackson, being the pragmatist, he was recognized how explosive the slavery question was. He actually hesitated at first to push for annexation because he worried it would fracture the Democratic Party and threaten national unity.
But in the end, his vision of a powerful America expanding across the continent won out, didn't it?
It did. His belief in manifest destiny and his suspicion of British intentions in the region tipped the scales. He ultimately threw his full support behind annexation, and while it didn't happen during his presidency, his endorsement paved the way for Texas to join the Union in 1845, just a few years after his death.
It's incredible how his influence continued even in his later years.
It really is, and speaking of his later years, his deathbed words really highlight the contradictions that marked his life. The light and shadow we were talking about earlier.
Those words are quite powerful and thought-provoking, aren't they?
They are surrounded by loved ones, including some of the enslaved people who worked on his plantation. He recordedly said, "I hope to meet you all in heaven." Yes, all in heaven, white and black.
It's a statement that reveals so much about his beliefs, his faith, and the complexities of his legacy. A slave owner expressing a hope for equality in the afterlife.
It's definitely challenging to reconcile those two things, and it forces us to ask tough questions about how we judge historical figures who accomplish great things, but also participated in systems that we now recognize as deeply unjust.
It's a reminder that history isn't just about dates and facts. It's about understanding human nature in all its complexity.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that people are products of their time, and that even those who fought for progress often held beliefs that we find reprehensible today.
Well, I think it's safe to say that Andrew Jackson's story is one that will continue to be debated and reinterpreted for generations to come.
Oh, definitely. He was a larger-than-life figure who left an indelible mark on American history, and his legacy continues to spark conversations about democracy, leadership, and the meaning of equality.
Thanks to Kimi for sharing her expertise with us today, and thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Andrew Jackson.
It's been a pleasure exploring his life and times with you.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep into the fascinating world of history.